Old is a relative term, by the way, meaning that to you he's old, but to someone who's 90, he's not old. Let's say maybe he's getting on in years or he's elderly, and that he is perhaps a little infirm. You know this word means infirm. If a person's infirm, they can be, let's say, not quite healthy, fully healthy, either in their body or their mind. He needs a stick, which he's leaning heavily on. It's not just an affectation. Look, I'll put this in the chat here for you. An affectation. It can mean something that people adopt as a mannerism or even as an object, which gives them a certain appearance to other people, like a bit of a pose. He doesn't simply use the stick to maybe convey an idea of a person who is, let's say, well-to-do and can afford to buy an expensive walking stick or something of that kind. Because remember, walking sticks could be used as a style accessory. People use them even though they didn't need them. But in this case, he needs it. He's leaning heavily on it. It foregrounds the idea that this case will take its toll upon Arthur. He's prepared to go to great lengths and make enormous sacrifices in order to exonerate his son. Now, if you exonerate, that means you prove someone free of guilt. You assert and have publicly acknowledged their innocence, to exonerate. It's going in the chat there, to exonerate. Arthur's willing to do everything necessary, including to make enormous sacrifices, and that includes his own health. That's why the stick at the beginning is essentially a prop. It's part of what Rattigan has chosen to use. It doesn't mean to say that in the real life situation, Archer Shee, the father, actually did have a stick. It's what the playwright has added to the play. And therefore he wants this suggestion to be moving throughout the play, and it does recur, as you will see. So at this point, you know, he's the patriarchal figure. We talked about that word before. A man who's the head of the family and looked up to and respected, and whose authority is more or less absolute, more or less, not entirely. And we have the introduction of Dickie and Grace. We've already mentioned that. You know, Dickie being the Oxford undergraduate, large, noisy and cheerful, and Catherine has got that somewhat masculine air about her, which is rather in contrast to her mother's feminine quality. So now we have a dialogue emerging between these new characters. Meanwhile, we've already noticed that Ronnie has fled to the garden. And so at the moment, Ronnie goes out of the audience's sight. But does he go out of our mind? That's the key to it all. After all, it is the Winslow Boy, isn't it? So we surely should have some focus upon him. And as you'll see, the playwright makes these rather subtle hints and suggestions that keep drawing our attention back to Ronnie, even though Ronnie is off stage. Again, it's a very clever device because we're reminded of the boy out there in the garden. Remember, it's raining as well. He's out there in the garden with the rain. We're feeling, therefore, some concern about him. And furthermore, there's a sense of anticipation. When will he return? At what particular juncture in this Sunday will it occur in the rather otherwise warmly familiar routine and cozy middle-class existence of the Winslow family? So we have a dialogue now, and it basically, as you can see, it's in medias res. You remember this term when things start in the middle of things, and Grace says, as she enters, "But he's so old, dear, from the back of the church, you really can't hear a word he says." She's speaking about the minister, the one giving the sermon in the Sunday service, etc. We can easily pick this up. Arthur retorts, "He's a good man, Grace, but what's the use of being good if you're inaudible? A problem in ethics for you, father." We can see straight away that Catherine has a somewhat, shall we say, intellectual approach to things, a little playful. Ethics is an exploration of essentially what is morally right or wrong in any particular situation, or in particular, perhaps to a profession. It's an ethical thing. Is a man who is a good man, but whose voice can't be heard by the rest of the congregation, doing any good at all? It's like really the question of right and wrong here. So Catherine's response after that is a little bit playful, and it indicates her sort of intellectual and even a little mischievous quality. So Arthur, as we can see, is standing with his back to the fireplace, again, adding to that warm domestic image, coming in from the cold and the rain, a man who perhaps needs to warm himself up. He looks round at the open garden door. There's a draft, Grace. Now, did you see the direction there? This is, of course, part of the acting directions and the staging. Arthur is looking at the garden door, and as he does so and refers to the draft, Grace goes to the door and closes it. You remember what I said a moment ago about Ronnie? Ronnie's gone out through into the garden. He's not there on stage for us, but he is there. He's there in our consciousness because our attention is being drawn to him. So there are two ways in which that's achieved here. One is by the dialogue, which draws our attention towards the door, and two, by the action of Grace going over to and closing the door. And it really reinforces for us the isolation of Ronnie. He's a member of this family, but he's not inside by the fireplace getting nice and warm. He's outside getting soaking wet in the rain. And furthermore, we're already invested in Ronnie emotionally. We feel sympathy for him. We are concerned about him because of his nervousness, his attempt to put on a bold face, you know, especially when, you know, Violet says that about being quite the naval officer, and we recognize the irony of that. And so Grace says, oh dear, it's coming on to rain. Dickie, I'm on Mother's side. The old boy's so doddery now, he can hardly finish the course at all. I timed him today. It took him 75 seconds dead from a flying start to reach the pulpit. And then he needed the whip coming round the bend. I call that pretty bad going. I don't think that's very funny, Richard. Now, Dickie, of course, Dickie is a friendly or an affectionate contraction of the name Richard, if you didn't know. It's actually what we call a hypocorism. We've had that word before. It's where you give a more affectionate label to a person through their name. It doesn't have to be actually the name itself. You know, if you have as a child, a very young child, you have little affectionate pet names for each other, nicknames. This is hypocritic. So what has Dickie done? Well, he's been irreverent. What does this word mean? Well, it means being disrespectful or not showing the due respect that we would normally associate in one's treatment of or attitude towards a person who ought to have some kind of authority in our mind. So he's a priest he's talking about, and he's speaking of him in terms of horse racing. He's pretending that he's a man who's a horse racing around a course. He's hardly capable of finishing the course, needing the whip. You know, he's whipping the horse onwards. So that's why Arthur is not amused by Dickie's manner, because it's seen as disrespectful. Again, roles and characters are being reinforced here. Arthur, the more serious type, the man who requires the necessary respect to be shown towards people in authority. After all, he himself is one. And Dickie shows the attitude of someone who's a little bit, shall we say, frivolous, maybe a little irreverent and playful. This is something, by the way, that will prepare us for several elements in his character later on. One being his attitude to what he discovers about his brother, Ronnie, and the other being his attitude to his own situation as an undergraduate at Oxford. So you'll see how this is being foregrounded now in his irreverent, rather playful and, in a sense, mischievous nature. So, oh, don't you, Father? Doddery though Mr. Jackson may seem now, I very much doubt if he failed in his pass mods when he was at Oxford. So Arthur reminds Dickie that he has been failing his exams, pass mods, exams at Oxford, and Dickie hasn't been doing the right thing at Oxford. He's been not studying adequately and he's failing. And so he brings the subject back to Dickie's irresponsibility. Again, helping to flesh out for us the characters. Dickie's agreed and says, dash it, Father, you promised not to mention that again, this vac. That's short for vacation, of course. You did, you know, Arthur. So obviously Grace sort of sides with her son here. There was a condition to my promise, if you remember that. Dickie should provide me with reasonable evidence of his intentions to work. The father shows a preciseness. He says, yes, I promised, but only if he fulfilled conditions. This is where the father shows that he sticks to the rules. It's again preparing us for a man who is very much dedicated and determined to follow what he considers to be right and the right course of things. Well, haven't I, Father? Didn't I stay in all last night, a Saturday night and work? You stayed in, Dickie? I would be the last to deny that, which is implying that, yes, you stayed in, but did you work? You were making rather a noise, dear, with that old gramophone of yours. I really can't believe you could have been doing much work with that going on all the time. So the gramophone, as we said before, is a music player. It's something that is used in the play as a prop. It represents not only their relative affluence, they can afford to buy one, but it also tends to reinforce the time because of the music that we see being played on it, or hear rather, you could say, and it tends to reflect the period of time. Funnily enough, Mother, it helps me to concentrate. Concentrate on what? Work, of course. That was not what you prepared to be concentrating on when I came down to fetch a book. Sleep, may I say, having been rendered out of the question by the hideous sounds emanating from this room. Arthur tends to adopt a rather elaborately formal register. Now, the word register simply means the level of language. It's formal, rather than being more conversational and colloquial. He adopts this slightly pompous level of language. It suits him because he wants to maintain this rather, shall we say, serious, even stern role as the patriarch of the family. And so he adopts language that has this more formal and serious quality to it. Again, it's part of, I think, what we see in Arthur. He cultivates this. We are told this by Rattigan earlier on. He cultivates this air of the patriarch. So he's basically saying you were playing music and not working. Dickie says, Edwina and her father had just looked in on their way to the Graham's dance. They only stayed a minute. What an idiotic girl that is. Oh, sorry, Dickie, I was forgetting you're rather keen on her, aren't you? You would have had ample proof of that fact, Grace, if you had seen them in the attitude I caught them in last night. We were practicing the bunny hug. The what, dear? The bunny hug. It's the new dance. It's like the turkey trot and only more dignified. I thought that was the tango. No, more like a foxtrot, really. Sometimes something between a Boston glide and a kangaroo hop. Now, we've had half a dozen almost names of different dances being mentioned to us. The purpose is really to emphasize those two things. One, the time frame when these were the popular dances. Number two, it's also emphasizing Dickie as a character. He's the sort of person who just likes to play and not work. Arthur, we appear to be straying from the point. Whatever animal was responsible for the posture I found you in, it does not alter the fact that you have not done one single stroke of work this vacation. Oh, well, I do work awfully fast, you know, once I get down to it. That assumption can hardly be based on experience, I take it. Dash it, Father, you're laying into me this morning, meaning you're really criticizing me. It's time you found out, Dickie, that I'm not spending £200 a year keeping you at Oxford merely to learn to dance the bunny hop. Now, I will pause briefly for a moment. Just firstly, on the reference to the funding of Dickie's university course. This is the first time that we are made aware of the financial dimension to the Winslow family. It costs this much money to send Dickie to university. Arthur is the man who supports the whole household, and he's mindful of the costs involved. We know that there is a case about to be undertaken, a defense of Ronnie in the courts. And this means that this will cost. And this is a recurring element of the play. It's a recurring theme, the financial cost. We've talked about cost. To defend a person against charges of some form of criminal behavior, which is exactly what's happened with Ronnie, accused and really convicted of theft. This requires resources, money to do that. And Arthur is ultimately given basically a choice. He is faced with a challenge. How far is he prepared to go? How much is he prepared to pay? And I don't just mean money, you already know that. How much is he prepared to pay in terms financially, in terms of the family's relationships, in terms of his health, even in terms of things like the other members of the family's rights and dreams. There's a lot of questions involved in what price justice. Really, that's the overriding theme that we're presented with in many respects. What is the appropriate price one should be willing to pay to, and I quote again from the play, to let right be done? How far would you go? It's a question that you can consider yourself. In the course of the play, do you think Arthur, for example, goes too far or not? This is what we are invited to consider in the course of the play. You've all been accused, I would imagine, at some time of doing something you didn't do. Hands up, please, if you've been once accused of doing something you didn't do. Basically, all of us. And you know, Charles Dickens once said something that I fully agree with. He says, for a child, there is nothing so keenly felt as an injustice. For a child, there is nothing so keenly felt as an injustice. I'm paraphrasing, but what he's basically saying is, especially for children, one of the worst things that can happen is when you're accused of doing something you didn't do, and no one will believe you. Do you understand? And in a sense, this is something that we as human beings, and I think particularly as children, we do have a keen sense of justice, of being able to feel that right is done in our lives. Because, you know, especially as children are mostly pretty innocent, aren't they? You know, let's hope so anyway.